Wise Chuck.
In your conversation with Mike Pesca, he said he's fine with Barry Weiss turning CBS into a right-leaning outlet, but doesn't that ignore two key issues? CBS is still a publicly regulated network and should serve everyone. And caving to Trump and Brendan Carr isn't just leaning right, it's enabling state pressure on speech. Am I wrong, Max W., Alexandria, Virginia? So I think you're both right here. And I think that in fairness to Mike, I don't think what Mike is saying is that if it's sort of and I think where I agree with him, it's like, look, every news organization has a bias, even if your bias is to try to be um, sort of neutral or sort of boring, whatever you want to call it. It's just a form of a bias, you know. So I think the question is whether um, what is it that they're hoping to do with CBS. The problem I have is the stuff they're trying to do with late night comedians, right? To try to um, force late night entertainment or any entertainment through the purview of government censors, if you will, right? I think that to me, and I think that's why you saw bipartisan outrage at Brendan Carr and what he attempted to do with Jimmy Kimmel and to try to bully Disney into getting rid of Kimmel, and they wouldn't do it. Or frankly, what Trump did do to Colbert with the Ellisons, or it appeared to do this. Um, so, ultimately, I think the problem is that it's while it's a publicly regulated network, it only is servicing its shareholders. So I think the problem I have is the fiduciary responsibility that these media companies have to shareholders, and why their news divisions aren't allowed to be fully independent, that they are subject to potential um, coercion because these companies have other business in front of the government, right? Other government regulatory things. So um, it's look. Do I think there could be different ways to manufacture the network news? I do. So whether that is perceived as leaning right or left shouldn't be the point. I think it is more, what are you trying to do with your news division? And who are you trying to appeal to? And are you trying to be a a news division that still does news gathering? Or are you trying to be a news division that wants to shape the public debate? So basically, I think when you look at MS now, Fox News Channel, and even CNN, I think that their editorial focus is about shaping the conversation rather than informing the conversation. I think that in theory, the broadcast networks were simply quote unquote news gathering, right? And that's why, the biggest chunk of money that MS now had to start spending new money on was news gathering, because NBC did all the news gathering for MSNBC. MSNBC was just essentially you know, uh, was always piggybacking off of NBC's news gathering operation. And what is a news gathering operation? It's literally the wire services or the bureaus that you put together, or the databases that that you get your information from, the reporters that you employ to go out and find stories, etc. Um, and I guess that I guess I'm so done. I already see that I've already moved on from CBS, ABC, and NBC. Like, I don't think the construction of the broadcast news networks, I think they're dead. And I just think that we are sort of living in the Bruce Willis sixth sense. The only three entities that don't realize they're dead are the people that run CBS News, ABC News, and NBC News. Um, I think the cable news channels have slightly more relevance because they actually have a following, right? The broadcast news divisions really have no following for their news. They have followings maybe for some style. People like, I I like I like to, see what David Muir's up to tonight, or I like um what's happening, at the Today Show, um, or Good Morning America. But that's almost for stylistic purposes on that front. I mean, I just think that this is not, they are no longer the primary drivers of where people get their information. And if anything, it's really the affiliates of these networks were the place where people would get uh, more of the quote information they were getting from television news than from the national side of things. Um, but you've had sort of politicians weaponize the national side of things just based on, Sunday shows or a personality they didn't like or anything. Um, so I that's what I guess when I'm saying I'm both right. Like I think what Mike kind of is more hinting at, it's like, hey, go for it, CBS, try something different. But I don't think CBS, NBC, or ABC are really in the news gathering business anymore. They have a few brands that they still are using, but in many cases, those brands are news shapers rather than necessarily news informers. And for that, I think just everybody's already. I feel like the audience itself has already moved on. So in some ways, I feel like this debate is about um, we're debating over something that used to have viewership but doesn't anymore. Anyway, not trying to be like totally just like, these grapes are sour type of, it's not about sour grapes. I don't think there are any grapes there. Whether they're sour or still taste good, that's not the point. It's just, I think that the public in some ways is sort of, it's, they kind of know that NBC, ABC, and CBS are not primary deliverers of information anymore, period. They're entities that host a lot of live events, mostly sports, but also some big news events, State of the Union, election nights, things like that. But I'm not sure it really is seen by a vast majority of the public as a place to get news, even if we're arguing about it still, if that makes sense. All right, next question comes from Michael Hammond in Everett, Washington. After listening to your episode about The Simpsons, I wondered how you think public figures should react to being the target of satire. I remember at least one SNL episode where someone portrayed you. Yes. Did you find it funny or frustrating? More broadly, what advice would you give a public figure or politician when a comedian takes aim? Michael Hammond. Well, number one is, even if you hate it, you say you love it. You know who did a very good job of this? JD Vance. The second um, the South Park debuted JD Vance as um, the little person from Fantasy Island. Uh, give me 1 second there. The character I think was named Tattoo. If my Gen X brain is working here. Um, a boss, right? And it was the whole thing. He embraced it and said, "This is funny," or whatever. You just right. It's when you come across defensive that you just sort of open yourself up. Oh, can't you take a joke? Um, Look, being a public figure is something. When you're not a public figure, you think you want it, and then when you become one in any sort of way, you find it can be claustrophobic, because suddenly you feel like, oh, I can't express my opinion anymore, or if I do, I'm speaking for too many other people, or I don't want to be a target and all this stuff, right? It is weirdly, it can be, right, because the internet is so cruel, and algorithms can make, and the other part is algorithms can make it feel like everybody's talking about you because all you're seeing is what is about you. So when you're a public figure, the algorithms really can screw with your head, and this is why, um, in some ways, the more public figure you are, the less you should be on social media, because it is gonna play tricks with you. Um, the thing that always, yes, I was portrayed, I think twice on SNL, um, was the mocking of my hair, which I found amusing, because it was true. Like, how sometimes what the beauty of satire is that a satirist can figure out pretty quickly, you know, and I've just look, I don't have my hair's not thin enough to do the head shave, but I'm not gonna do plugs. I'm not going to do any of that stuff. Um, yes, I tried the Como forward look, and now I just have just gone much shorter. As you can see, it is what it is. Um, and I'm not conceding. I'm never going the head shave. I don't think I have the head for it, and I fear I have too many chicken pox scars up there. Right? That's the real fear that I have about going head. But it was, I think that was the gag, and it was the only. I found it. I thought, wow, they could only mock me for my hair, so I felt pretty good, right? Like they didn't have anything else that they were overly mocking me for. So that, but the easiest thing to do is you just embrace it and laugh and like that's funny. Um, or I'm not, boy, my family's going to enjoy this, or my kids thought it was hilarious. Like that's the best way to handle it. If you start to humana, or try to explain it, or say, hey, you know what, they don't get this, they don't get. Look, do I think I've been unfairly portrayed? Essentially, in a very negative and character assassinated way by specific people in prime time on one cable news channel? Yes, I do. Do I think it was an agenda, purposeful agenda, because I was the most credible voice to many on the right at a supposed left-leaning news network? So it was in their interest to try to make me um, try to make me someone that was an antagonist to the right, even though there was no evidence of it, but they wanted to sort of guilt by association because they didn't like it that actually, my presence at NBC meant it was not a left-leaning network. If it, most of us at NBC are just sort of very much more in the broad middle. Um, but it was important for them to try to paint NBC as left as MSNBC, and the presence of MSNBC, my own presence on the cable channel, certainly made it easier to create that caricature. That was a campaign to try to delegitimize those of us that were, essentially uh, undermining whatever propaganda they were trying to sell people, and they wanted to get rid of that. So uh, I sort of get, um, that was always like would get under my skin more comedic stuff. That's nothing on that front. The only thing I wonder over the years is if because, but I also didn't, others chose to get in fights with Fox. I would not, because that's what they wanted, right? And so I've always believed in the rope a dope. I've always borrowed the Muhammad Ali strategy. Go punch yourself out. Take as many shots as you want at me. I'm going to continue to practice what which is covering politics as it is, not as I wish or you wish it were. All right, next one. Hey, Chuck, care to comment on why there is a mass exodus of staff from Heritage? Brian. I mean, I look, it is what it is. I mean, I think the Heritage Foundation, um, I think this is a case where the employees were there, conservative intellects have been there for a long time, and had seen Heritage had sort of shift, would sort of shift within the conservative movement. It was sort of, Heritage was always was sort of felt like the heart of the Reagan era, and so that's why for those of us of a certain age, we certainly view it that way. For what was clearly financial reasons, Heritage just pivoted to becoming, there are sort of two mainstream conservative think tanks in DC, sort of fighting for supremacy over the years: Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute. AI sort of became very synonymous with the Bush administration more than, and Heritage was always sort of a little bit more, I think one could argue, a little more synonymous with the old Reagan coalition. And then, maybe it was donors on the Heritage board, but Heritage really shifted to MAGA in a way. And I think it's simply because AEI sort of became the home of Trump skeptics, not necessarily never Trumpers, but Trump skeptics. My friend Danny Pletka, who's over at AEI, I put her in she's a conservative. There's a lot of policies that Trump's pushing that she can be supportive of, but there's no doubt the character and his foreign policy, she's never going to be a never Trumper, but she's never, I don't think, going to be a Trump evangelist either. And AI has been very home to um, the neocons, as well as home to sort of mainstream pre-Trump conservatives. And I think they have, sort of I wouldn't call them Trump supporters. I'd call them Trump adjacent, who are sort of a tad more comfortable with some of his policies than others are. But, I think that happens sometimes, right? On the left, you have the Brookings Institute, which is more center left, and you have Center for American Progress, which is more progressive left. And so I think Heritage ended up sort of becoming more MAGA, and then the more MAGA it went over time, I think the more it was going to alienate the more traditional conservatives that were over there. When Heritage and AEI were more like Coke versus Pepsi when it came to conservative movement, and now it's more like, I think, Coke versus lemonade, right? It's like just two distinct drinks that are different. So I suspect that Heritage does one of two things: either in a post-Trump environment, is reanimated with by conservatives who want to bring back the brand to mean the Reagan coalition, or it becomes synonymous. It sort of becomes the MAGA think tank. Though I thought the American Conservative was going to try to do that. So, there really is yet to be a true intellectual home completely for MAGA movement, and whether there is an intellectual through line of the MAGA movement that allows for a think tank to flourish, to me, might be a larger question. Next question comes from Ben from Minneapolis. Hey, Chuck, I was just listening to the podcast about predictive markets and that conversation. While I don't participate in the markets, I wonder how CNN is incorporating the data any different than any other sports coverage. The betting houses seem to have infected our sports viewing with nothing but betting. Just wondering. Ben from Minneapolis. This is my concern about it, right? Are we going to cover there's the president's going to appoint a new Fed chair. Two of the names that you hear are Kevin Hassett, Kevin Warsh. Here's what the prediction markets are claiming. What the hell does that tell us? Do you know what the prediction markets for Warsh versus Hassett are? Why they move? They move based on mainstream media reporting. So that's the stuff that I'm sort of skeptical of the prediction markets being of service to the viewer on that front. I guess I'll be curious how they try to incorporate it in their coverage of elections. You know, I could see CNN rationalizing itself by saying, okay, we're going to cover the Senate race, and so we'll use Kalshi's. Right now the prediction markets indicate, just 32%. 32% think Democrats are going to win the Senate, or are betting on Democrats winning control of the Senate, versus 68% that are not. I don't see how that's useful to viewers. But that, I assume that's the way they try to incorporate it. Um, do you incorporate it if you're doing a story about Venezuela? And I noticed that there's a couple of, Maduro will leave, will be out of power before Memorial Day 2026, or will be out of power after June 1st of 2026 or something like that. Um, I don't I don't think that's relevant to the average news consumer. I don't know how that helps you understand things, because again, these prediction markets are they're all based on, if it's based on insider information, then it's rigged, and if it's not, it's just based on publicly available information. So this is why I'm very curious how they use it. Um, I will, it's funny. It's like, I guess I'm okay with it for making long-term bets on who might be the presidential nominee for the two parties. That doesn't feel like a manipulative process, but betting on the appointment of the Fed chair weirdly does to me, or betting on when Maduro gets ousted just feels, if it's something people want to spend money on doing, so be it. I don't know why it's a news story, which would which incorporating Kalshi, for Kalshi, I get what they want out of it. It's advertising. Okay, great. And my guess is they've just, you know, they've basically become a title sponsor of something. Okay. It's no different than doing an internet poll. And it's like, who should be Time Person of the Year? Well, we did an internet poll and this is who they said. Um, Here are the prediction markets. I'm 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 trying to be talked into caring on this and that it will help. I had somebody say to me, well, the prediction markets are going to get politics better than polling will. And I'm like, the prediction markets are only, they're on all the campaign stuff, it's all influenced by polling. When a poll shows a race closer, the number moves. So in the direction that the poll was showing. So I don't see how that's going to make us, you know, that it's going to make it quote unquote more accurate. Um, Maybe it'll be more accurate for people that don't follow it closely. But if you're somebody like me who does this for a living, you know, you never let a poll that showed a tied race in a red state make you think that, oh, it's truly a 50-50 race. No, it's still a 60-40 probability outcome of a red state saying red, even if a poll shows it tied. This episode of the Chuck ToddCast is brought to you by Quince. And I love me some Quince. New year, colder days. This is the moment your winter wardrobe really has to deliver, right? If you're craving a winter reset, start with pieces truly made to last season after season. Quince brings together premium materials, thoughtful design, and enduring quality so you stay warm, look sharp, and feel your best all season long. Quince has everything you need: men's Mongolian cashmere sweaters. I have one. I have to say, really into it. They have wool coats, leather, and suede outerwear that actually hold up to daily wear and still look good. Their outerwear is especially impressive. Think down jackets, wool coats, and Italian leather outerwear that keep you warm when it's actually cold. Each piece made from premium materials, Quince delivers the same quality as luxury brands at a fraction of the price. The result is classic styles you'll love that hold up year after year. Like I said, you know me, I love me my quarter zips. Thank you to the Mannings for making quarter zips cool for us middle-aged men. Well, let me tell you, Quince has quite a few of them. They're great. They're both light and warm. Look, I think there's nothing harder than business casual, right? You get these things. What can I wear? What can you wear at a meeting? What do you wear on a Zoom? I have to say, it's as if Quince sort of says, hey, look, we've got the modern sort of working wardrobe ready for you. And that's probably the best way I'd describe it. It feels like it's clothing that looks stylish, looks good, but is actually practical, right? And isn't going to break the bank. So refresh your winter wardrobe with Quince. Go to quince.com/Chuck for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's right. There's no time limit on it. 365 days. Get the whole year. And it's also available in Canada. That's QUINCE.com/Chuck. Free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/Chuck. Don't forget the code. Use it to save some money. Next question comes from Jim in the Poconos. And he also adds circle the wagons, Buffalo Bills. All right. He says this: how long does it take for a presidential term to become irrelevant, if ever? I think about how my great-great-grandparents shaped where I am today, even if I barely know anything about them. Does something similar happen with presidents? Well, I think they do. And it is interesting to me. I'm going to introduce you to a different exercise, but it's a different topic, but it's a similar exercise. Um, and I heard it was an interview with Chuck Klosterman, maybe 4 years ago, 5 years ago. I've interviewed him on previous iterations of this podcast, and I enjoy his interviews with Simmons, Bill Simmons. And I read he's a few years younger than me, but I feel like he's the Gen X pop culture writer, right? He's my generation's pop culture writer. And he made the point of saying, you know, 200 years from now, there's only going to be one artist that represents rock and roll. Who will that artist be? And because he was saying it's like, over time that, more people fall off and truly, after 100 years, only a couple of people stand the test of time. After 200 years, even fewer, right? Like Beethoven and Mozart weren't the only composers of their era. They were the most famous composers of their era. And as we learned with Amadeus, there were other composers out there, Salieri, et cetera, right? There was a whole bunch of people writing music all the time back then, right? But only one or two, right? And I remember going through that question, and his thesis was it would be Chuck Berry. That, if 250 years from now, that Chuck Berry, more than the Beatles, might actually be and maybe the Beatles are in paragraph two, but that Chuck Berry, who, you know, is the godfather of rock and roll, founder, whatever you want to call him. I mean, I believe he is patient zero of rock and roll. Um, if you want to look at it in those terms. And I guess the point is that over time, right, we thin out. So, you know, look at how few presidents, and the other thing is how long were you president matters, right? Um, Calvin Coolidge, you know, he's barely, I don't think anybody's going to know who Calvin Coolidge is by the year 2100, right? Because by then we'll have at least um, nine more presidents, right? At a minimum, if you assume 8 years, 72, right? You know, so so nine or 10 more presidents max, maybe more, right? We could have as many as 20 more presidents, right? Um, so there's that. But I've thought about this. Think about Grover Cleveland, right? When he was elected, this first president elected in non-consecutive terms. He wasn't the first one that tried to come back and win. He was the first one that succeeded. I'm sure the Chuck Todds of the world back then, and the Steve Kornackis of the world back then, the Jonathan Martins of the world back then, the Maggie Habermans of the world back then, we all thought, boy, this Grover Cleveland, man, this is going to be historic. This is going to be an historic presidency. This presidency is going to live a long time, right? And other than the unique fact that he served non-consecutive terms and sharing the name of another baseball player named Grover Cleveland Alexander, right? Who was clearly named after him. But what kind of legacy is there left, right? So um it probably takes as long as it takes for our great grandparents to be, I when I was born, I had three living great grandparents. I have memories of three great grandparents. Um, the last great grandparent in my life died when I was 13. And I think about this, right? When they were born and the life they led and all this stuff. Um, and you know, I'm trying to remember the last time I had I thought about either great grandmother, right? It's been a while, and you do when you're around family and that happens, and that's when those, you know, but the minute when there's no longer anybody alive who knew that person, I think that's probably when the sell by date is there, unless you've made your mark in war or something, right? And so that takes about 100 years. So I think that the historical shelf life for an average president is about 100 years. And if you're sort of above average, either in bad or good, your shelf life might be an additional 50 or so, or maybe it keeps going if you're the first president, keeps going if you're the president that brought the union back together. Um, but you know, I'll give you just let's say World War III breaks out, and World War III is bigger and more consequential than World War II. Um, Remember, World War I was referred to as the Great War. We never thought there'd be a two, right? It got us, World War II. World War One became World War One because we got World War Two. So the point is that World War One became less relevant in how we were teaching it and how we looked at it. In fact, too irrelevant as far as I'm concerned, right? We don't, today's problems in the Middle East are due to the lack of resolution of World War One with the Ottoman Empire. Um, but if you look at that phenomenon, right, the point being is World War II will shrink in importance and relevance if we have another global war that um, that reshapes the world order, right? And then suddenly, there was a time the Hundred Years' Wars was front and center. You see where the point is that you're asking, and so it's like any historical event, but I think ultimately, when there's no longer anybody alive that can tell you what happened when that president was in office, is when I think they become uh, officially in the dustbin of history, unless they were remarkable, extra remarkable in some way or the other. All right, next question. Maybe you'll want to save this for your alternate history episodes at the end of the year, or I will answer it right now. But what if Joe Biden had come into office pledging only to serve one term, dedicated to reforming the presidency and the Congress and improving our democracy? I'm imagining an inauguration speech focused on pledging to turn norms into laws, thwarting a future president with autocratic aspirations by strengthening the power of Congress. What could this version of Joe Biden achieve? Judd B. from St. George, Utah. Well, I hope now that I'm answering this question for you, I hope you did hear my what if on how Biden's presidency could have been different without, if Trump he concedes normally, and how much his presidency differed. Look, he did pursue a democracy agenda, just he did it poorly, right? I think it was done. I think he did it, unfortunately, not in a bipartisan way. I think he sort of let it get hijacked by sort of the fever dream of those on the left that wanted certain things. Well, this is the time we can get this into law, rather than actually responding to the threat that we all felt in the moment. Um, Look, do I think I know why Biden didn't pledge one term and why nobody will run pledging a single term, because you become a lame duck immediately, right? That's the fear, that you don't have the influence, etc. Um, Perhaps Trump's aggressive second term, where we know he can't win again, is gives reminds people that, if you nothing prevents a president from fighting lame duck status if they choose to just insert themselves into the popular culture, embed themselves constantly into every conversation. So whatever you think of Trump, he has cracked the code. Like, now it's not a comfortable code for our previous presidents, but he's cracked the code on how you avoid lame duck status if you're willing to engage in almost any issue at any time in any format. He constantly is trying to keep himself relevant. So if you're going to pledge to be one term, you have to have I think you have to be willing to really be an always on president. I still think the failure of the Biden presidency was his inability to be Joe Biden. What do I mean by that? The Joe Biden I knew and I covered from, when I say I covered starting in 2000. I certainly started covering Biden going back to 92, but I didn't physically, I didn't start to at least know him a little bit, and then over time know him more and more, really until 2000, when he started running for president the second and third time. And that Joe Biden was going to travel the country a ton. That Joe Biden would have been a very charismatic president. I think that Joe Biden would have been a very active president. We got a very inactive Joe Biden. He was not the same guy. He did not have the same energy. And it's a shame. Joe Biden is, there's an expression nobody uses anymore, so this is going to age me, affable. That's Joe Biden. He is he was affable. He could get along with anybody. It was actually his great gift. He could get along with anybody in any class. And it is what made him so popular among Amtrak employees. It's what made him sort of, you know, he's the guy that just enjoys a good ice cream cone. Like it, and so, and it was that Biden that wasn't able to be president in 2021. And it, I go, look, I think the original sin was running in the first place, was running when you had all that family drama taking place. And when it turned out that, you know, look, um, Joe Biden's presidency was kind of like the Philip Rivers experiment, right? With the Colts. It looked like a presidency. It looked like a guy quarterbacking. But did Philip Rivers win a game? Right? What was Rivers' record? He was a functional quarterback. Biden was a functional president. But it wasn't the best version of Joe Biden, and it wasn't the best version of Philip Rivers. Anyway, so I go there on that front for what it's worth. Um, but I appreciate it. Just the thought of a what if scenario. What if Russia never sold Alaska to the United States? Um, then I think we would have 49 states, actually. I really do. Maybe Canada ends up with Alaska, right? Have we thought about that? That might have been more of a possibility. Do we, if we couldn't get Alaska, do we go and make the attempt at Greenland? Um, one of my favorite stories in the Grant book by Ron Chernow was learning about the obsession of some Republicans in Congress to get Canada as reparations for the Brits supporting the Confederacy during the Civil War. Meaning we almost got Canada as a state, right? We almost made Cuba a state after the Spanish-American War, So, um, that's an interesting. Does it mean we would have had during the Cold War one of the largest bases would have been a joint Canadian American base uh, in Western Canada as sort of the front lines against the Soviets, right? I guess it could have been something like that. But that's a fun one on that front. I wonder if it would be. Here's a question that I'd like to explore with a sort of historical geologist, if something like that exists, which I'm sure it does, because there's which would be, would Alaska resources, would the Russians have built the pipeline? Would the Russians have exploited the natural resources of Alaska more than the United States has, less than the United States has? Would it just be an even their version of, would it be Siberia, right? Those would be sort of some of the questions I would try to tackle. Um, but we'll put a pin in that. It's possible if I can find a 30 to 40-minute way to dive into that, I will. But on the surface, I don't see that doing it that way. All right. Next question. Per your suggestion, I watched Death by Lightning. I enjoyed it, but found it too short. So I read the book. I kept rolling my eyes at how often it mentioned national unity around Garfield. It made me sad to realize. Can I imagine that kind of unity today? Was the country really that united in grief and anger over his assassination, or did the author take some license? Loving the podcast, though. Just a reminder, there are other sports besides college football. Hint, hint. Baseball. Melanie from Sparks, Nevada. I'll be doing some baseball. That I promise you. Um, it will be very Nats whiny. What I really fear is I actually think I might have guests about the next lockout in baseball and how Major League Baseball is going to have to save itself. So here's all I would tell you with the Garfield story that I thought Death by Lightning did a terrible job at capturing. Didn't know how to capture. And I go back to, I sort of blame Netflix, not Benioff and Weiss, for this, because there is no way Benioff and Weiss said, hey, let's do a lighter version. Let's just do 4 episodes on this. I'm sure they pitched 8 or 12, 8, 10 or 12 episodes. um, because they left out the two most interesting aspects to this, and they just raced through the two aspects that each could have been multiple episodes and are the two reasons why in the moment this was a big deal nationally. One is how long Garfield lived before he died. He basically lived the entire summer. And the public at first blamed Chester Arthur and Roscoe Conkling and thought Arthur was behind it because of the way Gateau, who was just a crazy man, talking to anybody who would listen to him. He was available to any reporter that wanted to go interview him in jail and stuff. He was too willing to talk. So you had, we weren't, the mass media of its day was newspapers and stuff. But this was the first big trial of the century that everybody was following. It was a big deal in DC to be seen at the trial. I've got a ticket to the Gateau trial today because the trial began before Garfield died and then, of course, became a murder case after he died. So I actually think that was it's the hardest part to capture, and it was not even attempted. There were, they kind of show it, but there were thousands of people gathered when they knew the president was being taken to the Jersey Shore in order to try to convalesce. And in fact, there were people they took him on a railroad car and they wanted to keep it as smooth as they could so they didn't bump him. And they literally had to build the railroad as this train car very slowly was brought to the Jersey Shore. And it was just the public coming in to help. And then the Gateau trial had people obsessing over it. So that's the two pieces of the story that Death by Lightning didn't do a good job of capturing. The country's sort of obsession. We had a president who was in limbo for months. This wasn't like a couple of days. And then the trial, the first American trial of the century, before Scopes, there was Gateau. Okay. Before OJ, there was Gateau. Before any of right? It was Gateau. So, that would be my, my, and if you want, if I'd read a second book, with every historical moment, always, like anything, you got to read a couple different books. Destiny of the Republic is what Death by Lightning was based on. There's another book which I'm told you can get for free on Amazon, which is a bummer because the author deserves real royalties for this. But it's called Dark Horse, and it leans more into the political process, which of course I geeked out on and enjoyed. This episode of the Chuck ToddCast is brought to you by Wild Grain. Wild Grain is the first bake from frozen subscription box for sourdough breads, artisanal pastries, and fresh pastas. Plus, all the items conveniently bake in 25 minutes or less. Unlike many store-bought options, Wild Grain uses some simple ingredients you can pronounce and a slow fermentation process that can be a lot easier on your belly, little gut health there, right? And richer in nutrients and antioxidants. There's also no preservatives and no shortcuts. The Wild Grain boxes are fully customizable. In addition to their variety box, they have a gluten-free box, a vegan box, and a new protein box. I will tell you, I have done the gluten-free box. I have done it a second time. I have also used the ToddCast code, which I'm going to be telling you about in a minute. If you use the promo code ToddCast at checkout, you get $30 off. I've already used it as a gift to somebody else who loves this bread. Look, it is hard to find good gluten-free bread. I had never had gluten-free sourdough. It is fantastic. Follow the step-by-step instructions. It's not hard. We did it right the first time. And trust me, I rarely do anything right the first time when it comes to these things. So there is nothing like having an artesian bakery in your freezer to chase away the winter chill. Now is the best time to stay in and enjoy some comforting homemade meals with Wild Grain. I obviously highly recommend it. It is worth giving Wild Grain a try. Right now, Wild Grain is offering my listeners $30 off your first box, plus free croissants for life. Come on. When you go to wildgrain.com/Toddcast to start your subscription today. That's $30 off your first box and free croissants for life when you visit wildgrain.com/Toddcast or simply use the promo code ToddCast at checkout. This is a sponsor I absolutely embrace, so use that code. All right, next question. Comes from starts with a La Cheeserie, so I know what that comes from. Matt Mark from Damascus, Maryland. He's in the DMV. La Cheeserie, I had to chime in after the LeBron debate. He's a great player, but his arrogance and early finals performance always turned me off. As a longtime Penn State fan, I've got my fair share of Miami memories, some painful, but I agree college football's best sports experience, hands down. Love the pod. Thanks. Yeah, look, I'm just going to go back to, my favorite counterfactual when you have the debate between LeBron and Michael Jordan, and maybe we'll put Wemby in that debate soon, or Jokic in that debate soon, and all this stuff. There's one guy that should be in the debate longer, and it's Magic Johnson. Because you know what Magic did that Michael Jordan didn't do? He won an NCAA title and an NBA title in the same, basically back-to-back years, right? He ends his college career as an NCAA champion. And in his rookie year, he ends his rookie year as an NBA champion. You know who didn't do that? Michael Jordan. You know who didn't do that? LeBron James. You know who didn't do that? Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Although Kareem got fairly close. It was only a couple years. LeBron James obviously, didn't go to college, right? Yes, he won I think he won a high school state title. But anyway, I just want to put my plug in for, Magic Johnson basically had 11 seasons, 11 productive seasons. He won 5 titles in 11 seasons. Okay? 5 titles in 11 seasons. He loses, I think he's in the NBA Finals 3 other times, right? I think he's 5-3, if I have that correct. Or is it 4? Anyway. And his career's cut short by HIV and Karl Malone's prejudice. And if he basically, if he goes another 5, which he would have, there's at least one more Michael versus Magic NBA Finals. We only got one, right? Michael wins it, and then it was 4 months later that he's diagnosed with HIV. Magic Johnson is. They probably face off another time or two in the before the first Jordan retirement. I think Magic gets one. And if he has 6 and Michael never gets his 6, what's the GOAT conversation like? Anyway, just something to ponder. Next question comes from Bill Singletary, Newburgh, Oregon. Hey, Chuck, go Canes. I never stop believing. Right on, baby. As we head into 2026, what one word you'd use to describe how you feel about the year ahead, and who would be your dream interview for the late October? Also, do you think college football would benefit from adopting a more NFL style, dare I say, socialistic structure? Bill Singletary. Well, look, college football is going to need an antitrust exemption to do these things. I love the Nick Saban calendar idea, which is basically shift everything to the summer. The transfer portal doesn't open up until May, which is the end of the semester. Okay, so you can at least live in the fantasy of student athlete land. And then you have spring practice after the transfer portal in late May, early June. And then, then you prepare essentially for the season. You're essentially on the NFL schedule, right? They have they have the NFL draft. Then they have their first OTAs, which is their spring practice. Then they take a little bit of a break, and then they have training camp, and then the opening of the season. It seems pretty sensible to me, and I do think it allows you to still respect the academic calendar. Right now, nothing seems to respect the academic calendar, so it makes the whole student athlete conversation sort of even more ludicrous. One word I'd feel about 26. Well, I feel better about calendar year 26 than I did at the start of calendar year 25. And 25 went about kind of how I expected, that it would feel really uncertain, that it would feel like we were um it would feel like the equivalent of trying to walk on a moonwalk or one of those, bouncy houses, right? Where you never feel steady and you just have to plod along in order to survive. And, 25 was unstable, all those things. Um, I I guess the one word I would use to describe how I feel about 26 is um, I'm going to go ahead and say I'm going to use two words and say cautiously optimistic. I think I think more people are seeing a larger reality than did a year ago. I think we'll have a little more people sort of wanting to who are going to question, who are correctly questioning their initial assumptions more. I don't know. Maybe I'm hoping people are going to behave this way, but there's something I just feel like we've crossed that. I can hear it in my conversations with folks from all over the political spectrum over the last couple of months, which is um, we're not trusting anything, right? Trust is so low with everybody and everything, but we're kind of knowing now we're being BS'd, so we're looking for more verifications. It just tells me I feel like the information consumer is getting educated. And so I'm slightly more optimistic than I was a year ago, simply because I think the information consumer realizes they're being scammed and is actively trying to figure out how to feel less scammed. Um, and that in turn gives me some hope. Next question comes from Dan from Carlsbad, California, and he writes, as someone who follows the baseball card market, I'm very interested to see if Pat Ryan's call for the FTC to investigate trading card grading goes anywhere. Why don't we see more investigations like this in addition to legitimate monopoly concerns? This strikes me as a politically savvy move by someone in a purplish district. Look, anything that sort of gets at this, um, I think it I definitely think that the card market needs a little bit more attention and regulation to it as it grows. And I think the more it grows, the more attention it is going to get from the FTC. Um, I still think it's considered a niche or sort of a um, not a mainstream issue. And I'm going to be really cynical. The people most impacted by it are not necessarily people that uh, are presumed to be swing voters. So, you know, the card market is, it's a hobby, right? And it's a durable hobby. It's been around so long now, and it feels like it's getting a bit more financial foundation to it. Um, but it's the consolidation that I think deserves a bit more attention. And I mean, just look at what this Rubin guy is putting together with Fanatics, and I don't, more power to him, and I'm rooting for him to make cards less dorkish, right? Perceived to be the dork, where we have to, you know, where you go into a card shop and there's always been it's I always have felt like going into a baseball card shop was like watching the older guys go into the back room of video stores back in the day. It was like you didn't want to tell your friends that you went hung out at a card store. You didn't want to tell your friends that you looked at the adult section of the video store. Um, and there's, maybe that's in my own head a little bit, but I think there's still that stigma out there on cards. Um, though I think people like Tom Brady and their investment in it are certainly getting it more mainstream. But it is what Fanatics is doing, right? Consolidating so much of the sports experience under one umbrella. Card collecting, your memorabilia, your where you get the t-shirts, the sweatshirts, right? They do all that. I think they're also dabbling in sports gambling, right? That's to me what's begging for some look. And yeah, you have the different grading companies, but I'm you know, I look at the consolidation of just to get real dorky here of SGC and Beckett under the PSA brand, saying fine, because I think the next generation of graders are going to come from the AI graders and the AI technology. And look, PSA wasn't the biggest, and then it got credibility. You got a few other CGC interests me. I really like the quality um of their holders. I think they're very nice looking. Uh, and there's still something to be said about how people want to display their cards if they truly are. So I think that could matter. And I think the barrier to entry into card grading will only up, if you will, um, because of AI and all of that. But look, if Fanatics, I think this will really get the attention of the government. If Fanatics and the company that is the parent company of PSA collectors, if PSA makes if that attempts a consolidation, then I think you've got a real FTC case on your hands. Next question from Philly Mike. Hey, Chuck, longtime emailer, first time listener. Bad joke, I know. Do you have a recommendation for a good book on Roy Cohn? I've seen a few options, but don't know where to start. And I'm fascinated by how one person influenced so many dark chapters in American politics, from McCarthyism to Trump. Thank you for all you do. Your insights bring sanity to an otherwise chaotic political moment. So, look, there are okay Roy Cohn books out there, but the best Roy Cohn experience and the most I learned about him. So I would recommend, first of all, read his books first. So in the early 60s, he was sort of the first among the self-help legal books. How to not get screwed in your divorce or some stuff like that. Let me get the some of the titles of his book. First of all, the Sidney Zion book is the book. It's supposedly the autobiography of Roy Cohn. Sidney Zion was interviewing him towards the end of his life when he had been diagnosed with AIDS, was claiming it wasn't AIDS. But oh my God, I it's entertaining as hell. And it is, I think it's the best. You learn a lot about how the brain of Cohn worked. Um, it's the interviews take place in the early 80s. He dies, I think, in 86. So Sidney Zion's books is an absolute must read more than any others before you. And there's a few, look, the movie Citizen Cohn, and I think there's a couple of books that have gone on Citizen Cohn that are okay. But I think the Sidney Zion, because he was essentially going to be the ghostwriter, I think, for Cohn's own book. But go read some of Cohn's own books. If you read, none of them are very long, but here's one that sort of got a lot of traction back in the day, and it was written in the early 60s. How to Stand Up for Your Rights and Win. That was the name of the book. What you'll hear Trump's voice without Trump. It's astonishing. It's really impressive. So anyway, those are the two books. The Sidney Zion quasi-autobiography, because again, he get lots of cooperation for Cohn, but it goes in and out. He's pretty transparent about his how often he has them and doesn't have them, et cetera. And then read one of Cohn's authored books. That gives you a better sense of who he is. Then try to read the various biographies that were written after he died. But the Zion book is when he's alive. That's why that's interesting. And then you've got to read one of his other books. So that's how I would recommend getting into the world of Roy Cohn. All right. I'm going to race through. I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more questions. I'm going to try to do these fast so that I can knock them all out. Okay. This next one comes from Kyle B. I just finished the book Covert City by Vince Houghton and Eric Driggs, the story of Miami's role in the Cold War. Given your connection to the city and the book's intersection with South Florida politics, I refuse to live in a world where this isn't an episode. Big fan of the show. Keep up the great work. Kyle, great idea. Guess what book I have not read? I've not read this book. I did not know about this book. I don't know why I don't know about this book other than I haven't been to my one of my favorite bookstores in Miami called Books and Books. Um, but I'm going to read it, and we will turn this into an episode. So thank you. It is officially on my reading list, Covert City, because it's true, man. The Cold War. I mean, because we were an outpost. Look, I it's possible my grandfather was quasi. I mean, he admitted to me he had conversations with the CIA about Castro, but in his conversations, he was there warning. He claims he warned the CIA that Castro wasn't a good guy. My grandfather was doing work in rural Cuba in the 50s, and and he had in his offices, because he showed me this scrapbook. He had this eight by 10 glossy of a young Fidel in his fatigues. And I said, why do you have this photo? And he said, oh, if you were on the approved list, if you hung this photo up in your office, then his people wouldn't harass you. Something else. Anyway. So God, I got to read this book. Kyle, thank you for putting it on my radar. And I'm ashamed it was not. It just shows you it's impossible to keep up with everything these days, right? Next question, Christopher DiCarlo, Long Island, New York. How does it feel to be an independent journalist after many years with NBC? Uh, it was at first unsteady, a little weird. Now it just feels like, did I stay at NBC too long? That's how empowered I feel. That's how excited I am about the landscape coming up. Because look, ultimately, I, you know, I'm like an educated consumer is my best customer. I want to help people understand politics better. I want more vehicles to do this. I want people to feel more sure about where they're getting their information. And I now have an opportunity to help rebuild mainstream media from an independent space. Uh, I'm having a blast now. Um, Look, I was nervous. But I sort of see where this is headed, at least in my head. I've got a North Star, and not having to worry about upsetting a large corporate entity is truly liberating. Next one. Hey, Chuck, always look forward to the ToddCast. Your thoughts about MAGA starting to crack bring to mind a Leonard Cohen lyric. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. More people are starting to see the light. Happy New Year, Bob in Kansas City. Go Jayhawks. Bob, I should ask you, Kansas City, Kansas or Kansas City, Missouri? And where are you on the fight for the new home of the Kansas City Chiefs? Um, there you go. Leonard Cohen. He is underappreciated. That's for sure. One of my favorite Malcolm Gladwell episodes was his entire episode on the Leonard Cohen Hallelujah song. And just he did an entire episode of revisionist history just on and that interpretation of that song. Which is he is right. It is one of the more chilling. Leonard Cohen's version of it is unbelievable. All right. Next question. Dante Salters. Ooh, it's signed respectfully, which usually means there's a hidden critique. Um, he says, I'm very high on Governor Beshear for 2028 and consider myself an early supporter of his. Unfortunately, I missed your interview with Beshear. What was your overall takeaway of the governor as a potential 28 prospect? I see many who dismiss him, but I believe he has underrated and understated skills. Respectfully, Dante Salters. Okay. I thought it was going to be more. First of all, I'm sorry you missed it. I think there are remnants of it. I did it for Newsphere, so it's on my Newsphere feed, which you do have to become a member to go get. So we would love to have you. Um, Newsphere is news for the super informed, and I say this with where you're getting the good stuff. Um, so I would say that Beshear is still learning to be a national candidate, is the way I would come across. Um, is and um, I think he is struggling to be seen as both a mainstream Democrat and as a red state Kentucky Democrat. I think I I'm with you. The idea of Beshear, I'm very bullish on. The question is, how does it look in practice? Can he be sort of Bill Clinton circa 1991 and 92 and be the outsider mainstream center left Southern Democrat type, right? And I know Kentucky's not necessarily a Southern state, but it's certainly more like a Southern state today than it was back in the day. Um, I will say this. I almost sometimes think he's too polished. I think he needs more of a, I wish he had his dad's drawl, right? Andy has less of a drawl than Steve does, Steve Beshear, who of course served as governor as well. Um, there's a part of Andy Beshear that feels like he's too refined. It's sort of like Al Gore versus his father. If you're old enough to remember sort of Al Gore's father in office, I'm not old enough to remember it, but it was sort of a similar. Al Jr. was definitely the Harvard trained Southern boy, right? But who grew up in Washington. And I'm not saying that, but I think an underrated problem for Beshear is the fact that he's a scion and the fact that he sort of, it's not that he grew up in privilege, but that he grew up in a political family. And I don't know whether that's going to be a demerit come the start of 2028. I think his strength is how comfortable he is with in rural America. And part of that has been with just the relentless amount of natural disasters that hit Kentucky during his governorship. He has had quite a few where he has had to be the consoler the governor, a consoler as much as he was a governor. And of course, none of that knows party and all of that. That's what makes that a good story for him. Um, but you know what he doesn't have yet? He doesn't have this signature either issue that says, this is Kentucky Democrat. That's different. Um, so I see the potential, but is he, I'll be very curious to see how he handles positioning himself ideologically as the sort of chief cheerleader for Democratic governor candidates in 2026. He's the chairman of the DGA. He'll be traveling the country trying to help governors. Does he make political points? Does he help some governors who are a little more center than governors who are a little more liberal? I'll be very curious how he handles that. How does, how does he position himself when campaigning with Tim Walz in Minnesota versus campaigning with Rob Sand in Iowa? I think he's going to be all over Rob Sand in Iowa. I think, and I think he's going to be a little nervous about campaigning with Tim Walz. So, um, I think he's got a lot of potential. I am skeptical the base of the Democratic Party will fully embrace him without him having to sort of move a little bit further towards the base than Bill Clinton had to. And I wonder if that takes away his best asset. Anyway, that was my impression. He is. I feel like he is trying to make the case that he is part of that he is can be leader of the party rather than a disruptor of the party. And I think he needs to figure out how to be more of a disruptor of the party. I think that's where Bill Clinton found strength as a center left candidate when he did it. All right. Last question for this two-part mailbag. Chuck, I don't know if you have answered this before, but growing up in Miami and being a lifelong Hurricanes fan, how did you become a Packers fan? Always enjoyed your podcast, Paul S. from Covington, Louisiana. I will tell you, my father grew up in Waterloo, Iowa. What did that mean? It meant his best childhood memories were in Iowa. He wished he was raising me in Iowa. I used to joke, he used to raise me Iowan. What did that mean? My first savings account was not at a bank in Miami. It was instead, sorry, I was interrupted there. My dog is chewing and destroying a pen as we finish. She is very anxious for me to finish this mailbag. But she was cracking it. I was like, what are you blowing up? Just waiting for ink everywhere, but I digress. So father, my first savings account was with the Waterloo Savings and Loan. Yes, this was before the S&L crisis. So that was where I had my first bank book, was a Waterloo, he wanted me to have ties to Iowa. Well, it also meant he was anti-Chicago, and his favorite NFL team was always the Packers. He was not a fan of the owner of the Miami Dolphins, a man named Joe Robbie. And he used to complain that Joe Robbie used to steal money out of the University of Miami athletic department because the Hurricanes and the Dolphins shared a stadium back then too, the Orange Bowl, and Robbie controlled the concessions, and the concession money then never went to the Hurricanes, and I think over time it finally did, but that used to like chap my, and so that was like one of his grievances. That's how emphatic we were about the Hurricanes. So it was. I think the other thing is my dad was a conservative, and Robbie was a liberal Democrat from Minnesota. So he never said that, but that was always there was always a little bit of that in the back of my head about this of why. But he was always angry. He always had an issue with Robbie and how they treated the Hurricanes. And he grew up in Iowa, and which was you were Green Bay. You pulled for the Packers in football, not the anything whoever the chief rival, Chicago, all things Chicago was like New York to somebody in Iowa. So um, that's he was a Packer fan. And so very early on, I read Run to Daylight. I read the Jerry Kramer book, Instant Replay, early on. And guess what I did? I did the same propaganda to my son. Um, and he read the whole Jerry Kramer. He read. I gave him the newer Lombardi book, the Marinus book. It didn't exist then. Back then, which was just the Run to Daylight book. Um, and he's embraced it in some way. He's a. He will tell you he thinks he's more of a Packer fan than I am, but we've I have he is a third generation Packer fan, um, and none of us have ever lived in the state of Wisconsin. However, my father's father and mother, early in their marriage, before my dad was born, did live in La Crosse, Wisconsin. So a fourth generation, technically. So I can say I did have a fourth. My grandfather lived in Wisconsin for a period of time, and his brother was a lifelong Wisconsin resident. So those are my Wisconsin ties. But yes, I'm an unusual Packer fan. But hey, in the '80s, I was the only kid rooting for the Packers in Miami, while everybody else was excited about Dan Marino, which meant I threw myself into Hurricanes football even more so because that was the one local gig, local team I could root for, and my dad was not going to be mad about it. All right, um, what a great first 9 months for the podcast. The questions I got, what a great um, uh, set of listeners and smart. In some ways, I wish I could just create content this way with you guys more often, and maybe we will. Maybe I'll make the mailbag thing a little bit more regular, where we, maybe once every couple of months, I clean it out, right? I empty the mailbag, and do that so that we don't let these great treasure of ideas slip through. So with that, thanks for listening. Till we upload again.